This is Ted Rodgers. I'm in Khon Ten, Thailand, and I'm talking on behalf of TESOLacademic.org, who has my permission to use whatever comes out of this in any way they so choose. I was Jack Richards, old friend from the University of Hawaii, recruited me as co-author for a TESOL article, and out of that he said, let's do a book. So we did edition 1, Approaches and Methods of Language Teaching, and that went very well. And so 15 years later we did edition 2, and we're now working on edition 3, third edition of Approaches and Methods, which is due in manuscript form to Cambridge on the 1st of April. So I'm kind of avoiding my writing responsibilities by doing video recordings. Today I was talking about what have we learned out of the evolution or revolution in methods over the last really 100 years. So I started a little bit with grammar translation, going to audiolingual methodology, going to communicative approaches, particularly task-based instruction and content-based instruction. And each of these had some things of real value, and one of the things we're trying to do in the third edition is to look at the value still carryovers from those earlier approaches and methods, which to some extent, as something new came on stage, have been abandoned and kind of forgotten or a bit ridiculed. And I think one of the things I try to say is there is value there, and people, teachers, will ultimately, they need some help, and methods I think are a big help when you're learning the profession. You need to have some prototypes. This is something to do to get me started. But people early enough develop what I call a personal pedagogy, and that's what I'm really interested in now, what feeds into personal pedagogy. And I'm trying to take samples of various past enthusiasms and say, you know, there's still value in these. Let's try to mine that value and see how we fit into what your personal pedagogy might be. And along the way, at the end, I'll say what I've learned out of this experience of putting together a book and my own teaching that I think suits my personal pedagogy. And not that that should be everybody's personal pedagogy every more than your method didn't have to be my method and vice versa. But this is an example of where I kind of wound up things I think of value in my own teaching and effective in terms of helping the students, the kind of students I teach, to such language mastery as they master. So following from the task-based and content-based approaches, and some shortcomings in terms of definition, in terms of trying to figure out what tasks best support language learning, what content best supports language learning, and the theory holds, and perhaps the practice, that in terms of content has to be relevant to the student. It has to be organized. There has to be examples of language stuff that you can do with that content, and it has to be not only relevant but of interest to the student. And so I somewhat tongue-in-cheek said, well, an ideal language course might then combine sex, religion, and politics, being of always relevant, high interest, and in fact, such high interest, they're forbidden topics in family dinners and language teaching courses. But as an example of how serious do we take our own claims that contents should be relevant, should be interesting, should be lend itself to interactivity. And I gave an example of what I would do if I organized a course based on sex, religion, and politics, and in the talk. And then I said, well, okay, some of the shortcomings of that, of task-based and content-based instruction. And there was a kind of move to, rather than specifics of teaching, principles of teaching and learning. And I looked at 5 examples of principles published in a variety of sources, and they were identical in 2 respects, one of which they were all 10 in number. There are 10 principles of language learning and teaching, and they were all in the imperative voice. So I thought that was interesting, and I tried to see what the overlay, what the congruence of those principles. One would hope if language teaching is the principle, there would be considerable agreement on what the principles are that one would base one's teaching on. And the overlay was not great. The one theme that seemed to be resonate in all 5 of the statements of principles was something called cooperative learning, cooperative activity, which has always been a major interest of mine. I directed a program called the Hawaii English Program in Hawaii, and a major theme of that was peer tutoring and peer learning, pair learning. And I've carried that interest on into various places. I've lived overseas, Malaysia particularly, where we had experimental, basically schools, about 1,000 students. We paired every first grader with a 4th grader, every 2nd grader with a 5th grader, every 3rd grader with a 6th grader. And basically the younger kids would dictate the story to the older kids, which they would prepare as a reader and teach the younger child to read that and then give it to them. They would be illustrated and they'd take them home. And for most of those kids, it was the first book they ever had. And not only was the first book they ever had, but it was about them. And they could read it. So they took it home, kept it on their pillows, and read it to their parents and aunties and uncles, and anybody would listen. And I thought that, and this was across ethnic, sex differences, ethnic differences. Most of the partnerships, there was enough energy between the age differences. The older kids, a lot of them were used to having taken care of siblings, younger siblings, and the younger kids would look up to these older partners who were teaching them to read and writing down what they said, formatted. And I thought that worked so well after a couple of iterations, and we had class movement and the whole thing, where are they going to go, and chair sizes, what happens if a pair doesn't work, and so forth. But I ironed out a lot of those problems, issues, I would say, and it was a very enthusiastic reception. Some Peace Corps volunteers, some local Malaysian school teachers got very enthused about that. And that was going to become my worldwide missionary version about pairing younger kids in the school system with older kids. And we worked out a pretty good routine, both administratively and pedagogically. And I thought, we've got something here. And then the Ministry of Education got very interested in that and took all the experienced teachers we have and sent them overseas for scholarships. So there was nobody left who knew anything about doing this. And by the time they got back, they had developed a new set of enthusiasm, their own personal pedagogy, and 2 years later. So I was a bit bemused about, you couldn't say don't go. I mean, this was a shot at further education, some overseas visibility, and a chance to look around. So they went, and but the program as such just kind of disappeared, filtered into the landscape. But I still think, like I was saying about methods, I think we learned a lot about not only pedagogy, but about the personality of kids and their parents and the community, and how to mobilize some of that for, I think, really effective learning. And the kids kept those books till they turned to powder underneath their pillow. Anybody come by, they would read their book about themselves. And the teacher, like Cambridge University Press, became an editor. I'm going to make you look good, not a corrector. And I think anybody who writes appreciates a good editor. You don't think about, correcting my beautiful writing, thinking my writing is going to get better when filtered through an editor. So it could have kind of different slant on what the teacher does, the function of the teacher as editor, and we talked about editing and how you could be looked to be much more brilliant than you might appear at first glance through the helpful editing of your teacher. And we had a whole series of routines about pair bonding and making up a nickname and a trade name for your pair, and some treasure hunts and something we did as a pair to build some bonding for this experience of the younger kids learning to read and the older kids learning to write, and having a real audience that would appreciate what they had written, and the readers having a real older partner that they were in link to some success in schooling, which a lot of them had not had much of up to that point. So I still think amongst the treasured reminiscences of yesteryear is that program, and like looking back on methods and approaches rather than trying to look at ways to fault those. Why did they disappear from usage? Look at what gets ignored or forgotten that was of value that motivated these in the first place. And I think that's a worthwhile pursuit. It's kind of fun, a very academic exercise to fault find, and this new thing be called communicative language teaching, or the wonders of educational technology, obviously has value too, but that does not mean that the predecessors had no value, nothing to learn or to share with whatever the current focus or enthusiasm is in methodology. So that's a good pausing point.